Our scripture lesson from this morning comes from a place that Mother's Day sermons typically don't come from. Comes from the book of Hosea, chapter 11, verses 1 through 4. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called him my son. But the more I called them, the more they went away from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness and with bands of love. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to them and I fed them. Here ends the lesson. May God transform understanding into action. Amen. So the elephant in the room. It's Mother's Day, yet I am not a mother. What? Shocking, I know. Nor is my wife. My wife is not yet a mother. I say yet because we're thinking about it. But I want you to know this morning that if you are a mother or a parent of any kind, or if you've served in a mentorship role in which you've been motherly or fatherly to someone, you're in good company this morning because this scripture lesson begins with God describing God's self as a mother. It's kind of a big deal. We often think of the scriptures as being written by men for communities of men, and in some cases that is true. Certain scriptures reflect the society in which they were written. They describe a man's world, and they assume, mistakenly, at the time it was written, that the world would always be a man's world. And yet now we live in a society that allows us to share in equal rights and equal benefits. Now, that is not always true. It doesn't always work out that way, but that's the idea. To an unprecedented degree in human history, we have a greater sense of equality. So when we find little gems of passages like the one in Hosea this morning, in which God describes God's self as a mother, we have to hold on to those passages because they reflect the overall complexity of the Bible that sometimes gets ignored. Yes, there's a lot of reference to men and how great men are, but then we have moments like this that seem to trump and critique and dismantle our sense of who God is. God is not some big old guy in the sky. God is a mother. God teaches Ephraim to walk. But without some context, because Hosea is, let's face it, not the most popular book in the Bible, it might be easy to actually miss what's going on here. So at the risk of dumping too much history on you, which my wife warned me not to do, I'm going to do my best to provide you with a little bit of context and then move on. See, Hosea was writing some 8 centuries before the time of Christ. He was writing in Israel. But technically, there were 2 Israels. Israel was a divided nation with essentially 2 separate kingdoms made up predominantly of Hebrews. Although they did accept citizenship from strangers, it was predominantly Hebrews. And they were in a really good place. They had settled into a life in their homeland, and they had a kingdom with a lot of resources and assets. Now, in the past, we've talked about how God was reluctant to let the people have a king and a kingdom. And one of the reasons God was perhaps reluctant to let Israel look just like everybody else was because of what this passage alludes to. So let's bring it to the surface. Israel was doing quite well for itself, but they were not on God's good list. God was quite displeased with the fact that they had grown in wealth, they had grown in military might, and they had also gone about embracing other gods, specifically gods from their neighboring cultures. The fear was that in some way they had lost a piece of their identity, a piece of who they were. And God was afraid if things didn't change dramatically and change soon, that could potentially be lost forever. So he sends Hosea to talk to the people. But Hosea is kind of a cool guy, despite the fact that we rarely ever talk about him. For one thing, he was a prophet, but he was also a performance artist. Seriously. The book of Hosea begins when God tells the prophet Hosea to get hitched. I want you to get married, God says. It's time for you to settle down. And Hosea says, great. Do you have someone picked out for me? And God says, yes. And Hosea says, great, who is she? And God says, well, she's on that street corner over there. And Hosea says, wait, what? See, it turns out that God wanted Hosea to marry a woman named Gomer, who was, let's say, a woman of ill repute. So Hosea, who was a prophet, ultimately marries this prostitute in the first 2 chapters of the book of Hosea and buys her out of her contract. He essentially helps to set her free, all under God's instructions. But the marriage isn't exactly a happy one. And so they end up having 4 children, and his wife presumably is not faithful to him, and he's unhappy with her, and so they bicker quite a bit. How could this have been part of God's plan? And so God says to Hosea, actually, this is like my relationship with Israel. I redeemed them. I bought them out of slavery. We seem to potentially have a good thing going. We could have a nice life together, but we're just so unhappy together. We're not listening to each other. We made promises, but we're not keeping our promises. We're not doing what we said we were going to do. So your life and your marriage will become a symbol for all the people of Israel. I want you to write down your experiences, almost like journaling them. And people can figure out on some level what I feel like as God, having redeemed and saved this people and having them be so thankless, having lost their way. In this particular passage, God evokes the image of a mother caring for a child by saying, I taught Ephraim, which was the largest tribe in Israel, and also another name for Israel sometimes, as a kind of shorthand. I taught Ephraim how to walk. But now that Ephraim knows how to walk, Ephraim has abandoned me and run away. Now, again, I've never been a parent, but I've had friends who've parented their kids oftentimes when we're going on, dinner dates or get-togethers, and you bring your kid along because they're just old enough to go out in public, right? It's nice when they learn how to walk, but then the very next thing is the fear that they're going to get into something they're not supposed to. Because at least when they're not mobile, they're not going to run away from you in that moment. But the moment they learn to stand on their own, then they become independent on some level. Perhaps not as independent as they think they are, and that's part of the problem too. But I'm sure a lot of parents can relate to that fear of, oh my goodness, now that you're up on your feet, you're going to get into all sorts of things. Sticking your fingers in things they don't belong in, touching the stove, going out and playing in the front yard and I don't know where you are. Or maybe just falling down. It doesn't have to be a crisis moment. Just falling down. You're not as independent as you thought you were. And so God says to Hosea, your relationship, your act of getting married and then being a parent to 4 children is going to mirror my experience with this people. And here we are, after all this time. Again, this was quite some time before, this was like 8 centuries before Jesus. And yet, we're still having conversations about what it means to live in a good, whatever that word means, society. We've built a very different society from ancient Israel. It looks and feels quite different, and yet in a lot of ways, the things we struggle with are the things they were struggling with. They became incredibly wealthy as a nation. They were quite well-to-do, which was especially remarkable because they were a fairly small country. They didn't actually have that much geographic space or that many people, but they did quite well for themselves. And so then there's this tension between what we have and what we might want to share. Furthermore, they had gone off in pursuit of other gods. In some cases, like I said before, the neighboring gods of other tribes and countries. In other cases, and Hosea alludes to it in a different passage, they actually went back to worshiping the golden calf from all those years ago when Moses led them out of Egypt initially. For some, the worship of the golden calf had actually not died down. And at the point that we come into the story this week, they're actually worshiping this thing on a regular basis. It has its own religious infrastructure set up around it. And so God says, wait, I thought we had this conversation. That thing's not real. I am. Besides, it's made of gold, so then there's an association between religion and wealth, or religion and power. And God says, I'm not a big fan of that. So God has an issue there. I thought we talked about this. How could you have gone astray so much, so dramatically? And so Hosea and his family become guinea pigs for God expressing his displeasure. They were a military nation now, too. They had an infrastructure of men with swords and weapons who could fight on their behalf. How many times, if we go back through just the first 5 books of the Old Testament, do we remember stories of the Hebrews being outnumbered? Wouldn't it have been nice to have a strong military on our side to protect us in those days when we felt most vulnerable? Instead of a pillar of fire and a cloud as divine symbols of God's protection in our lives, wouldn't it have been nice to have some good old-fashioned weapons? And they said yes. And so they built an army. They had the money, they had the manpower, they could do it. So they did it. And God says, no, now you're a warring people. This wasn't the point. Why are you worried about safety? Why are you worried about whether or not I'll protect you? Why is it that you so insistently want to duplicate what all the other nations are doing? You have something special. Don't squander it. This is something we think about a lot as individuals, right? Living up to our parents' expectations for us. Sometimes in a good way. Our parents see perhaps the best parts of ourselves, and they can push us along to help us grow and develop into the people that they know we were meant to be. On the other hand, the other elephant in the room this morning is that many of us don't have healthy relationships with our families and don't necessarily enjoy the benefits of having that person that you can automatically lean on. Mother's Day can be especially difficult. Father's Day can be especially difficult. These are times of year when we remember if our relationships haven't exactly been functional. We remember that and we carry that with us. We struggle with what might have been. Could it have been better? Could our relationship with our parents have been more wholesome? This is a time of year when we start getting nostalgic for a reality maybe we've never even really experienced. But we see those cards, those Hallmark cards that tell us, you know, to the most amazing mother anyone has ever had. And you think, wow. You know, if you're the person who has a mother like that, you're like, lucky me. If not, that can be kind of hard. The funny thing, though, is one of the reasons why I love this whole book of Hosea is that God uses the metaphor of a family to describe his relationship to Israel, but it's an incredibly dysfunctional family. So if this morning you came to church thinking, oh my goodness, it's Mother's Day, how am I going to get through this service? Because I've been there, by the way, gritted teeth thinking, I do not relate to this at all. The good thing to know is that Hosea's family was a mess. I mean, it wasn't good news for him, but it's good news for us. His family was incredibly dysfunctional, and maybe ours is too, but either way, we still encounter folks who serve in that mentorship role, who serve in that family role. I have been mothered by people who I have no biological connection to, people who have served that role of essentially teaching me how to walk, not literally, but in terms of navigating a complicated world. When you're a kid who has a rough relationship with your parents, you sometimes have to look for mentors and parents outside of your biological circle to learn some of those skills that are necessary for survival. But the reality is, I think most of us have someone, even if we have a good relationship with our family, someone who isn't biologically family, who still feels deeply connected to us, who we still see like a mother or a father figure. And those are the people, like Israel was meant to learn from God, that we can learn from to be the best versions of ourselves. We don't have to be blood relatives. They teach us how best to navigate the ins and outs of a complicated world. They teach us how to be good citizens, hold the door open, smile, the little things. They also teach us bigger things like integrity, kindness. I had a mother figure in college. She was a former professor. We later became friends, and long after I graduated, we've stayed in touch. She played the role of my mother at my wedding, actually. She did the readings my mother would have done, and it was really wonderful because I just kept thinking how lucky I was to have met someone who was able to mother me into intellectual curiosity. She was a professor. She pushed me to embrace questions I didn't even realize I had. And so now, after all this time, many of you bear the brunt of that. You have to deal with the results of my inquiries and my questions and my studies. But she sparked that. I never realized that there was all of this stuff waiting for me to uncover. The mind is such a fascinating thing, and she mothered me into that. How fortunate. I'm sure, and I invite you today to think about those specific connections that maybe don't look like the traditional mother role that we've been conditioned to think of, and that sometimes we feel bad because we haven't experienced it, and maybe think, regardless of what your family life is like, who else has served in a mother-like role? This passage was not intentionally linked to this weekend's news, specifically the news that Israel is fighting again. If you've been watching the news, after the situation with Iran kind of escalated, Iran fired rockets from Syria. Israel protected itself mostly with the dome, but then started firing rockets back into Syria, and now things have escalated to the worst they've been in a few years. Although it seems like every few years we say that about the Middle East crisis, right? There's another blow up. So this wasn't specifically related to that. I didn't initially choose it for that reason. But as I was watching the news, I thought, how fitting. And not just for Israel, but for us as Americans and as citizens of Lowell, as members of this community, how important it is for us to be reminded what it means to walk in the way that we were conditioned to walk, to be the kind of people that God made us to be. Because, again, it's tempting when you feel and perceive yourself as an independent person. It's sometimes hard to know what you don't know until something goes wrong and you need a reminder from someone who's been there. One of the things I love about church and love about the age differential in terms of myself and churches that I've often participated in is that I feel like I'm learning life experiences from people who genuinely know what they're talking about. I see and encounter stories that I don't hear on the news that help me navigate life in a new and better way. Part of being in community is learning how to mentor and mother and father one another. We come at it in different ways. How do we maximize the use of it? Sometimes we need reminders. As American citizens, sometimes we need reminders that we aren't the only country on the planet and that our actions have consequences. Now, that's not a left-right thing. That's not a Republican-Democrat thing. It's not even really political at all. Politics is just the medium. The reality is, as human beings, our actions have consequences. So we need to think about, as a nation, how we treat one another. As citizens in a small town like Lowell in particular, what I love about, and I grew up in a small town, what I love about a small town is it's very easy to know who to talk to about an issue. It's very easy to learn how to get involved, right? Because it's a small enough community that you can make a couple phone calls or ask around or talk to someone you know. Hey, who's in charge of this? And you can get involved. If there's a cause you want to volunteer for, you can pour yourself into it fairly easily. That's one of the benefits of a small town and of being a good citizen in a small town. It's a little bit easier to figure out how best to utilize your resources. The same discernment process, though, is true for churches. It's, again, and we're going back to stewardship, it's part of what stewardship actually is. Learning what we're capable of so that we do the right thing with it. Learning what resources we have so that we maximize them. One of the mistakes that I don't want to make, and I don't think we'll make it as a congregation, frankly, but I keep it in the back of my mind just in case, is that we get so comfortable in this building space because, and we'll talk a little bit more about that next week, but we're on the very cusp of finalizing the deal with the Cornerstone Fund, which means the building is more or less secure at this point. We're in a really good place, but I don't want to get complacent. I don't want to make the mistake of Ephraim, and I don't want to make the mistake of modern-day Israel, or of the United States today in some cases. I don't want to make the mistake that so many children often make, which is that you get a sense of your own independence and you think you don't need anybody else, and then you batten down the hatches and you become isolated. Kids need their parents, churches need their communities, citizens need leadership, and so on and so on and so on. This is, again, going back to the web of connections idea that we talk about when we do the morning prayer. So my invitation to you this week, as Mother's Day ends, but we're still in the stewardship season, as Father's Day comes up very soon, is for us to think about all of the ways in which we have learned how to walk, and then think about the ways in which we have stumbled. And I invite you to be as honest with yourself as you can possibly be in those stumbling moments. Where are your shortcomings? And then find someone. It can be your mother or your father. It can be someone who mothers or fathers you, someone who draws from their own wisdom and experiences and can help you navigate this. You're never too old to learn. We never stop needing parental figures. We never stop needing to draw on the wisdom of others. So my invitation, find those shortcomings. Find those places where you need to learn how to walk. And then begin to take those baby steps. Lean on your friends, lean on your church family, lean on your mentors. It's not easy, but like any child taking its first steps, that sense of freedom is exhilarating. Enjoy it. It's as easy or as difficult as learning to walk. Amen.